You have not simply been transported to another continent. You have been transported back many centuries to ancient Greece. This is not just a journey along a tourist map or a tour of an open-air museum. It is a complete, all-encompassing immersion in a world where everyday life is so different from our own that you will experience a permanent and profound culture shock. The most basic values, habits, norms of behavior, social structures, and even ideas about humanity are all turned upside down here compared to what we are used to in the 21st century. Get ready, because now we are going to look at 5 absolutely normal things in ancient Greece that would plunge any modern person into deep amazement, bewilderment, and sometimes outright horror. Each of these norms would force us to rethink literally every aspect of life, from personal hygiene to social justice. The habit of daily showers with hot water, an abundance of fragrant shower gels, hair shampoos, shaving foams, deodorants, mouthwashes, and other personal hygiene products. All this would have disappeared in an instant if you found yourself in ancient Greece. Notions of cleanliness and personal hygiene were radically different there, and their methods might seem strange, if not repulsive to us. Forget about soap in the modern sense, with its foam and cleaning properties, as it was not widely used and was used mainly for washing clothes, cleaning wool, or in very specific religious rituals. The Greeks used olive oil to cleanse their skin. Yes, that's right, it was their main hygiene product. They would rub their bodies thoroughly with the oil, which not only served to dissolve dirt, sweat, dust, and dead skin cells, but also acted as a moisturizer to protect the skin from drying out in the hot sun. The oily mixture and dirt were then scraped off with a special curved metal scraper, usually bronze or iron, called a strigil. It was a standard hygiene tool used by both men and women, especially after exercise. This procedure certainly helped maintain some cleanliness by removing the top layer of dirt. But it would be completely alien and perhaps even unpleasant to us, accustomed to the feeling of squeaky cleanliness after a shower with abundant foam and complete washing away of all fat. Imagine the feeling of greasiness on the skin after such a bath, perhaps with remnants of earth or sand that were not completely removed, and how different the natural smell of a person would be, which was not masked by chemical perfumes or deodorants. Body odor was not considered something shameful or something to be disguised. It was a natural part of being human, taken for granted, even reflecting to some extent one's physical activity, status, or occupation. Moreover, the process of using the strigil itself could be quite abrasive, causing discomfort or even micro-damage to the skin if used too vigorously, which today we would consider too rough and unhygienic for delicate skin. After intense training, athletes could be covered in a thick layer of dirt, sweat, and oil, and scraping it off in front of other people in public baths was also a perfectly normal practice. What about oral hygiene? Modern soft-bristled toothbrushes, fluoridated toothpastes, dental floss, antiseptic mouthwashes are all the result of much more recent scientific and technological inventions. In ancient Greece, people brushed their teeth using coarse linen cloths, rough plant twigs, such as those from the mastic tree, or simply rinsed their mouths with water after meals to remove food debris. Sometimes, to freshen breath or disinfect, they chewed certain herbs such as mint, parsley, or myrrh, which had astringent, aromatic, and antiseptic properties. The result was obviously far from our ideal of a Hollywood smile. Dental problems such as caries, tartar, gum inflammation, gingivitis, periodontitis were common, and many Greeks lost their teeth at a young age, which led to serious problems with digestion, changes in bite, diction, and, of course, facial appearance. Bad breath was a common phenomenon, which people took calmly and which did not cause such social rejection or embarrassment as today. This highlights a fundamental difference in personal hygiene standards, which would have discouraged us, to put it mildly, and perhaps even forced us to keep a permanent distance from our interlocutors, or at least greatly rethink our ideas of cleanliness and comfort. The appearance and ideals of beauty were also different from today, sometimes in a radically opposite way. Today, many strive for a golden tan, considering it a sign of health, attractiveness, an active lifestyle, and financial well-being, spending hours on the beach and in solariums. In ancient Greece, especially for noble women, the ideal was pale, almost snow-white skin, untouched by the sun. Tanning was associated with physical labor in the open sun, that is, with low social status, belonging to commoners, peasants, or slaves who were forced to work in the fields or at the market. Therefore, noble women avoided the sun at all costs, wore wide-brimmed hats, petas, wide cloaks and veils, and sometimes even used bleaching agents based on chalk, rice flour, or, what was especially dangerous and harmful to health, lead, which was extremely harmful to their health and could lead to chronic poisoning, anemia, and organ diseases. For us, this might seem a strange, unhealthy, and even morbid desire for an unnatural pallor, which sometimes looked sickly. Men, especially athletes and philosophers, could have more tanned skin, which for them was a sign of strength, health, activity, and their social status, allowing them to spend time in the fresh air. But perhaps one of the most shocking aspects was the attitude towards nudity. In our society, public nudity is strictly taboo, except in very specific contexts such as nudist beaches, saunas, or medical facilities, and its public display can lead to serious legal consequences. In ancient Greece, especially among men, it was part of everyday life and culture without causing embarrassment, condemnation, or sexualization in the modern sense. Athletes, both men and sometimes women, in some regions, such as Sparta, where women also competed in athletics and their bodies were valued for strength rather than beauty, trained and competed in the Olympic Games, the Pythian, Isthmian, and Nemean Games, and other pan-Greek competitions completely naked. Nudity was not perceived as shameful, indecent, or exclusively sexual in the modern sense. It was a symbol of physical perfection, discipline, valor, health, and naturalness of the human body, a manifestation of its beauty, strength, and harmony, worthy of the veneration of gods and men. The practice had deep roots in the cult of the body and the celebration of athletic achievement. Imagine yourself in a stadium, watching hundreds of naked men sprinting, wrestling, for example in pankration, where all parts of the body actively interacted, throwing discuses or javelins, with their bodies covered in oil for protection and shine. This would have been a profound culture shock and would probably have caused awkwardness, embarrassment, and an inability to focus on the competition itself, rather than on the bodies of the participants. Public baths were also places of complete nudity. Greek baths, palaestra, gymnasium were not just places to wash. They were important social centers where people socialized, discussed politics, philosophy, made deals, exercised, read aloud. No changing rooms with cubicles or bathing suits. Everyone was completely naked, regardless of age, social status, or physical features. This created an environment where the concept of personal space and bodily integrity was completely different from ours. For us, accustomed to privacy and modesty in such places, this would have been incredibly uncomfortable and embarrassing, causing us to want to leave the place quickly or avoid it altogether. Even the sculptures and images of gods and heroes that decorated temples and public places often depicted them naked, emphasizing ideals of the body, harmony, and divinity that we may be accustomed to in art, but which are dissonant with everyday public nudity. On the other hand, it may also have promoted a healthier, less inhibited attitude toward one's own body, something we may lack today. In terms of medicine, although the ancient Greeks, thanks to figures like Hippocrates, considered the father of medicine and author of the famous oath, made significant advances in understanding the anatomy and physiology of the human body, their treatment methods were often far from our standards of sterility, anesthesia, and effectiveness. Operations were performed without any anesthesia, and surgeries were extremely painful and dangerous due to the lack of antiseptics and sterile instruments. Knowledge of germs, bacteria, viruses, and infections simply did not exist. Hygiene in medical procedures was minimal. Instruments could be reused without proper cleaning, which led to high infection and mortality rates even after seemingly successful operations or healed wounds. Many diseases that are easily treated today with antibiotics, antiviral drugs, or simple procedures, e.g., common infections, inflammations, appendicitis, fractures, were death sentences back then from which people suffered for weeks and then died in excruciating pain. People often turned to doctors, who were very limited in their abilities, for help, but also to the temples of the god Asclepius, the god of medicine, where healing was associated with sleep in sacred groves, incubation, and divine intervention, which to us would look like a mixture of medicine, religion, mysticism, and superstition. We would find it difficult to trust our health to a system that relied heavily on dreams, predictions, religious rituals and prayers, rather than just scientifically based knowledge, and the lack of basic hygiene during treatment would raise serious concerns for our lives and health. Diagnosis was often based on superficial observation of symptoms, analysis of body fluids, blood, urine, bile, without a deep understanding of the causes of diseases, and treatment was limited to herbs, diet, exercise, and bloodletting. In ancient Greece, especially in such a militarized polis as Sparta, this concept would have been completely alien and even ridiculous, and those who defended it would have been perceived as crazy. The attitude towards children was harsh, pragmatic, and aimed exclusively at the interests of the state, not the individual, which would be one of the most shocking and morally unacceptable aspects for us. Immediately after birth, the fate of an infant depended not on parental love, desire, or affection, but on the decision of state authorities. In Sparta, the newborn was examined by the elders of the city, called the Gerousia, and the Ephors. This council, composed of old and wise men, decided whether the child was worthy of living and becoming a citizen of Sparta. If the child was weak, had any visible physical defects, looked sickly, or simply did not seem strong enough to become a strong warrior or a healthy mother, he or she could be deemed unfit for future life in the strict Spartan society. In such a case, the child was mercilessly left to die, most often in a ravine known as the Apothetes, at the foot of Mount Taygetos, or in some other remote, deserted place, doomed to a certain death from hunger, cold, disease, or attack by wild animals. This was done to improve the gene pool, to prevent the emergence of weak or feeble members of society who might become a burden to the state or be incapable of military service, and to maintain the fighting capacity of the army. For us, living in an era when every child is considered a precious life and has an unconditional right to exist, regardless of his physical condition or abilities, this would be an act of unimaginable cruelty, barbarity, and inhumanity. A similar practice, although not as strictly regulated and not always fatal, existed in other cities, such as Athens, where parents could also reject a child if he did not live up to their expectations, leaving him on the doorstep of the house or in a certain place, which reflected a utilitarian attitude towards children, rather than unconditional love and protection. If a baby was lucky enough to be deemed fit, his life was still far from our idea of childhood. In Sparta, at the age of 7, sometimes even earlier, as early as 6, boys were taken from their families without any sentimentality or farewells and sent to special state military camps called agoge. This was their new childhood, harsh, merciless, and completely devoted to preparing for war. There they lived in communities under the strict supervision of mentors, pedonomoi, slept on hard straw mats, sometimes even without them, right on the ground or on mats made of reeds that they had to collect themselves, wore a minimum of clothing, even in the cold season, in order to harden their bodies and spirits, accustom them to the cold and hardships. They were fed poorly, the portions were intentionally small to accustom them to hunger, deprivation, endurance, and independence, and to develop ingenuity in the search for food. Discipline was the most severe and unquestioning. Any disobedience or manifestation of weakness was punished. They were deliberately starved so that they would learn to steal food, but were severely punished if they were caught. Not for the fact of stealing, but for being caught, showing clumsiness, insufficient cunning, or secrecy. This developed cunning, resourcefulness, the ability to survive in difficult conditions, to be unnoticed, and to act in conditions of shortage. Soldiers who were unquestioningly obedient, fearless, ruthless, hardy, and absolutely loyal to the state, ready to die for Sparta without hesitation or doubt, without thinking about personal interests. Any manifestation of weakness, crying, tenderness, attachment to family, or individuality was strictly suppressed and ridiculed by elders and peers, and only courage, endurance, and loyalty to the community were encouraged. Physical punishment, including public floggings, for example at the altar of Artemis Orthia, where boys were whipped with whips as part of a ritual until complete exhaustion, and sometimes to death, testing their resistance to pain, were a routine part of the educational process, designed to toughen the spirit and body, accustomed to pain and not to feel fear. These boys were taught to read and write only to a minimum extent. To be able to read military orders and understand the laws, since the main emphasis was on physical training, military exercises, the development of endurance, strength, and Spartan brevity of speech, laconicism, the ability to express oneself clearly, succinctly, and to the point, without unnecessary words. The concept of a mummy or spoiled child would have been absurd and shameful in Sparta, and any such manifestation was severely punished. We would see children deprived of parental love, accustomed to pain, deprivation, submission, and a complete renunciation of individuality from a very early age, which for us is absolutely unacceptable and cruel treatment, violating all our ideas about the rights of the child. Girls in Sparta were also brought up strictly, but with a slightly different purpose. Their physical development was very important. They ran, did gymnastics, threw the discus and javelin, participated in public competitions so that their bodies would be strong and capable of bearing strong and healthy children for the state future warriors. Their education included music, dancing, choral singing, but all this was subordinated to the goal of strengthening the community and physical health. Although they did not go to the agog, their life was also far from effeminacy and was oriented towards physical perfection and the education of future Spartan mothers, who had to be as stern and devoted to the state as the men. Boys from wealthy families were sent to private schools, grammar and music, from the age of 7, where they studied reading, writing, arithmetic, music, playing the lyre, flute, and also did gymnastics in the palestra. Later they studied rhetoric, philosophy, literature, history, preparing for the role of a citizen. However, discipline was strict, and teachers could use corporal punishment, for example, hitting the hands or back with a stick, to maintain order and obedience. Girls in Athens were taught primarily at home, housekeeping, spinning, weaving, sewing, managing slaves, and sometimes reading and writing if their parents could afford it. But their education was much more limited than that of boys, with no focus on public life or intellectual development. Their primary role was to prepare them for the role of good wife and mother, the keeper of the home, rather than for an independent intellectual or public life. The idea that the child should be at the center of the family, that his wants and needs should be a priority, that he should be provided with as carefree a childhood as possible, with plenty of toys, games, and emotional support, would have been completely alien to the ancient Greeks. Children were perceived as future members of society, who needed to be prepared as quickly and effectively as possible for their adult roles and responsibilities to the polis, rather than as independent individuals in need of individual development and emotional support. The most shocking and morally repugnant aspect of ancient Greece for a modern person is undoubtedly its widespread and deeply rooted slavery. In our world, slavery is recognized as a crime against humanity and is prohibited in all civilized countries. It is associated with the darkest pages of history and grave violations of human rights. But for the ancient Greeks, it was an absolutely normal, fundamental, and integral part of their economy, social structure, and daily life. It was not something exceptional or marginal. It was the backbone of their society, ensuring the prosperity of free citizens and their leisure for politics, philosophy, art, sports, and public affairs. We would see slaves all around us, and their disenfranchised position would be deeply outrageous and shocking. Slaves constituted a huge part of the population. According to various estimates, in some cities, such as Athens, their number could reach 1/3 or even 1/2 of all residents. Imagine walking along the streets of a modern city, and every third or fourth person you meet is someone's property, a thing, and not a person with their own rights and freedoms, their own will, dreams, and dignity. This is unthinkable for us, living in a society that proclaims equality, freedom, and dignity of each individual as basic, inalienable principles. Slaves had no rights. They were objects of purchase and sale, gifts, pledges, and could be inherited. Their life, their body, their labor, their offspring, all belonged to their master. The master could punish the slave in any way, including severe corporal punishment, torture, or even murder. Though killing a slave could incur a fine, since it was considered property damage, not human murder. Slaves had minimal protection, and their testimony in court was often accepted only under torture, since it was believed that the slave would not tell the truth without coercion, being interested in self-defense or revenge. For us, this is tantamount to admitting that human beings can be things devoid of any personal dignity, which is absolutely contrary to our basic moral principles and modern humanism. Slaves performed all sorts of jobs that free citizens considered unworthy, too hard, routine, or dangerous, ensuring the functioning of the entire polis. In the mines, this was perhaps the most terrible fate for a slave. Thousands of slaves worked in incredibly difficult and dangerous conditions, mining silver, especially in the Laurium mines near Athens, which were the main source of wealth for the polis. Copper, iron, marble, granite, and other minerals. They spent long, grueling hours underground, often chained to work, in total darkness, breathing toxic dust from the ore with little ventilation and minimal protection from cave-ins. The life expectancy of the miners' slaves was extremely short due to exhaustion, injuries, lung disease, silicosis, hunger, unsanitary conditions, and lack of medical care, making their work a literal death sentence. Imagine seeing thousands of people literally living and dying underground, deprived of any hope of freedom or a better life. Their bodies and souls being destroyed for the sake of someone else's wealth. In the fields and in agriculture, they worked the land, sowed, harvested crops, e.g., olives, grapes, grain, tended livestock, providing food for the entire polis. This work was physically exhausting, required constant exposure to the scorching sun, and did not provide any personal freedom, forcing the slaves to live in constant subordination to the master. In craft workshops, slaves were skilled craftsmen, potters, blacksmiths, builders, weavers, weapon makers, shipbuilders, jewelers, tanners. Their labor was the basis for the production of most goods, which were then sold on the market or used in everyday life. Some slaves could be highly skilled specialists, but they still remained property. Sometimes owners rented out their slaves to other craftsmen, or even to the state to carry out large projects, receiving payment for this, which was an additional source of income. In homes, they were domestic servants, cooks, cleaners, porters, nannies for children, wet nurses, laundresses, and sometimes teachers. If the slave was educated, often from conquered lands or captives who could speak languages or have knowledge of science. In state institutions, some slaves belonged to the state, for example, the Athenian Scythian archers, the police of Athens, slave scribes, mint workers, city employees serving the bureaucratic apparatus. They performed various functions: policemen, scribes, executioners, custodians of order in public places, cleaners in public buildings and temples. As sex slaves, female slaves and slave boys were often sexually exploited by their masters or their guests, which was part of their powerless status and was not considered rape, since the slave could not give or refuse consent, and it was not punishable by law. This was one of the most terrible aspects of slavery. The idea of slave rebellion, although it did arise, for example, the numerous rebellions of the Helots in Sparta, who were an enslaved people, was usually brutally suppressed with incredible ferocity in order to maintain order. For example, Sparta had a special system of Helots, enslaved natives of Laconia and Messenia, who worked the land for the Spartans and formed the basis of their economy. The Spartans declared annual cryptia against the Helots, secret warfare in which young Spartans could kill Helots without warning to keep them in constant fear and obedience, and also to practice stealth and killing, thereby honing their military skills. The social structure was rigidly fixed and gave little chance for change of status, creating a deeply divided society. At the top were the full citizens, free men born of full parents, owning land, having the right to participate in the political life of the polis, own property, serve in the army, for example, hoplites in Athens or Spartiates in Sparta, participate in the courts. Their rights and duties were the basis of democracy in Athens or oligarchy in Sparta. Below them were the metics or perioeci in Sparta, free people living in the city but without civil rights. They could be foreigners, merchants, artisans, bankers, artists, who paid taxes, a special metics tax, served in the army, but could not vote or own land in full and were obliged to have a citizen patron. They lived in society but were not its full members. And at the very bottom, as already mentioned, were the slaves. There was virtually no opportunity for social mobility. Moving from slave to free citizen was an extremely rare exception. For example, through ransom by the slave himself or his patron, the granting of freedom for special merits, especially in war, or the will of the master. But it was not a systemic phenomenon. A freed slave, apolute, often became a metic rather than a full citizen, and his descendants could remain metic for several generations without ever achieving full citizenship. For us, living in the era of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, such a social structure would be not only unacceptable, but absolutely barbaric, inhumane, and deeply immoral. We would not be able to accept that human beings are treated as property, and that their lives have no value other than that which their masters assign them. We would be constantly confronted with the cruelty, injustice, suppression of human will, and complete lack of humanity that for the ancient Greeks were the everyday norm, raising no questions about morality, no doubts about their legality or naturalness. The fourth was the seclusion of women and the purpose of marriage. In ancient Greece, with the exception of the relatively free Sparta, where women had somewhat more rights and freedoms, although subordinated to the interests of the state, the position of women was extremely limited, subordinate and isolated, which for a modern woman, accustomed to equality of rights and opportunities, to the choice of a career, to public life, would be a real shock and a serious blow to self-perception. The idea of emancipation or women's movement would have been completely incomprehensible and even absurd for the ancient Greeks. They simply would not have understood what was being discussed, considering such a state of affairs to be a natural order of things established by the gods and nature, in which each sex has its own clear role and place. The role of women was limited to two main functions: running a household and bearing children, especially sons, who could continue the family line, become full citizens and inheritors of the family property. Women had virtually none of the rights and freedoms that we take for granted in the modern world, such as the right to vote, the right to own property independently, the right to an education, and the right to choose a spouse. No political rights. Women could not vote, hold public office, speak in court on their own behalf, only through a male guardian, usually a father, brother, or husband, who represented her interests, participate in popular assemblies, or participate in any other form of political life. Their voice had no weight in the public sphere, and they were completely excluded from the public life of the polis, which was the exclusive prerogative of men. Their existence was entirely concentrated in the private life of the home, isolation in the gyneceum. In Athenian houses, there was a separate area for women. The gyneceum, the women's half, often located at the back of the house or on the second floor, away from the eyes of strange men and from the street. Women were not allowed to go out into the street without the company of a man, husband, father, brother, or even a trusted slave, and even then their movements were strictly limited to certain purposes, such as attending religious festivals, funerals, or rare visits to close relatives. Their goal was to preserve the good name of the family, its honor, and to prevent any gossip or suspicion of infidelity that could disgrace the name of the male head of the family. For us, 21st century people, accustomed to freedom of movement and communication, imagine that you, as a woman, are forbidden to move freely around the city, visit markets, socialize with friends, or conduct business outside the home unless approved by a male guardian, and your life is spent mostly within four walls, under constant control and surveillance. It would be like living in a voluntary but imposed prison, deprived of freedom of movement, communication, and the ability to make your own decisions and choose your own path in life. Early and arranged marriages. Girls were married off very early, sometimes as young as 13 or 15, just after reaching puberty, when they were still essentially children. Their husbands were men who could be considerably older than them, often twice or three times their age. For example, a 40-year-old man could marry a 15-year-old girl, which was considered normal. Marriage was rarely based on love, affection, or mutual consent between the spouses. Rather, it was an economic and social transaction between families, aimed at strengthening ties, increasing property, creating political alliances, or, most importantly, continuing the family line. The bride's father would negotiate with the groom, and the girl would pass from the guardianship of her father to the guardianship of her husband, who would become her new master and legal representative. Her dowry, the property the bride brought to the marriage, remained her property legally, but only her husband could dispose of it, and in the event of his death, it passed to his heirs if they had no children. The only thing a woman could demand in the event of a divorce initiated by her husband was the return of her dowry. The main purpose of marriage was the continuation of the family line, especially the birth of sons who could become full citizens and inherit the family property. The birth of daughters was often a cause for disappointment, as it required a dowry for the future marriage and did not ensure the continuation of the family line in the male line, which was considered less valuable. Lack of education. While wealthy boys received a comprehensive education in schools, studying literature, philosophy, rhetoric, music, and gymnastics in preparation for public life and intellectual debate, girls were taught primarily at home. Housekeeping, spinning, weaving, sewing, cooking, managing slaves, and sometimes reading and writing if their parents could afford it. But their education was much more limited than that of boys, not oriented toward public life or intellectual development outside the home. They were given no philosophical, rhetorical, or military training, considered unnecessary for their role in society. Their main task was to prepare themselves for the role of a good wife and mother, the keeper of the hearth, and not for an independent intellectual or social life. Separation of the male and female world. Men spent most of their time outside the home, in the agora, market square, in gymnasiums, at symposia, feasts, in political meetings, discussing politics, philosophy, literature, art, and engaging in trade. These were exclusively male clubs and places of communication, where female citizens were strictly prohibited from entering. The world of women was strictly limited to the home and very rare religious ceremonies or women's holidays, which gave them only a temporary opportunity to come out of isolation and communicate with other women. Imagine a society where men and women hardly ever intersect in everyday social life. Their worlds exist in parallel but do not intersect, and this is considered completely normal, causing no questions or discontent. Hetaira as an exception. The only women who could relatively freely communicate with men, attend symposiums, and participate in intellectual conversations were hetaira. These were educated, talented women, often foreigners or former slaves, who had received an education and had an independent position, who were not married and often earned their living by providing various services, including sexual ones. They could be cultured conversationalists, musicians, dancers, singers, actresses, and some of them had considerable influence in Athenian society. However, despite their influence and education, their status was still inferior to that of full married citizens, and they were often the object of condemnation by conservative circles of society, perceived as a class of women who lived outside the generally accepted norms and morals. For a modern woman, accustomed to choice, independence, equal rights in marriage and profession, the opportunity to build a career, get an education, move freely and express her opinion, such a state of affairs would be intolerable, deeply offensive and limiting. She would find herself in a world where her voice does not matter. Her life is predetermined by a man, and her purpose is limited to bearing children and serving the home, without the right to self-realization outside these rigid frameworks. This would be a profound shock, limiting not only physical but also intellectual freedom, as well as personal development and self-expression. If you thought you were surprised enough, ancient Greece had plenty more in store when it came to social mores, public-private boundaries, and sexuality. What we consider strictly intimate, personal, or unacceptable for public viewing was completely normal and unquestioned to the Greeks. It might leave us with a constant sense of discomfort, embarrassment, and even rejection, since our notions of privacy have evolved over millennia. We have already mentioned the completely naked athletes at competitions and in public baths. Imagine a row of seats or holes in the floor without any partitions, where people relieve themselves next to each other, perhaps having casual conversations, discussing the latest news, philosophical ideas, or even business deals. This is completely different from our modern, isolated and private toilet cubicles, which provide maximum privacy and a lack of social interaction during such physiological acts. The lack of developed sewage systems and sanitation as we know it would also mean that the cities of ancient Greece would have smelled very differently from modern megacities. These smells could have been quite intense, unfamiliar, and not always pleasant, which would have affected the overall perception of the urban environment and comfort. The display of emotions in public could also be different, more open, stormy, and demonstrative than we are used to. We are usually more reserved in expressing strong feelings in public, trying to save face, dignity, and not attract unnecessary attention to our personal experiences, preferring to experience grief or joy in solitude. In ancient Greece, especially during funerals or mourning, grief could be expressed very stormy and demonstratively. loud lamentations, crying, sobbing, tearing hair on the head, scratching the face, beating oneself in the chest. This was part of the ritual and was not considered excessive or shameful. On the contrary, it was a socially approved way of expressing grief, and the louder and brighter the mourner showed his feelings, the more respect and sympathy he evoked from others. We would probably feel uneasy and unsure of how to behave if we witnessed such vivid and immoderate displays of grief in a public place where everyone could witness someone else's deep sorrow, which today is considered very personal and private. Public speeches, political debates, and even theatrical performances were also more emotional and expressive than our modern equivalents. The most difficult to understand and accept would probably be attitudes towards sexuality and various forms of relationships. Modern Western society is largely monogamous and heteronormative, and certain forms of sexual relations are considered taboo, frowned upon, or legally prohibited. In ancient Greece, however, there were much broader and more varied ideas about sexuality that were integrated into social and cultural life, rather than hidden or taboo. Pederasty. This was a common and often socially sanctioned practice, especially in aristocratic circles, among warriors, and in education, in city-states such as Athens and Sparta. The relationship in question was between an adult male, erastes, which translates as lover, or in love, usually a man over 30 years of age, and a young boy, eromenos, beloved, who was on the threshold of manhood, usually between the ages of 12 and 18, before he had grown a beard. These relationships were not always exclusively sexual in nature. They often involved mentoring, education, and spiritual and moral training. The older man was expected to impart to the young man his knowledge, life experience, moral values, military training, politics, philosophy, art, and civic duties, and this was considered a noble form of intellectual, spiritual, and civic development, contributing to the formation of a full-fledged citizen. The sexual aspect, although present, was often considered secondary to the educational one. For us, such a relationship, especially given the significant differences in age, power, and potential exploitation, would be highly questionable, immoral, and often considered sexual abuse or exploitation of a child. However, in Greece it was considered part of a normal social institution, although it had its own rules and restrictions. For example, it was forbidden to give a young man expensive gifts in order to avoid accusations of prostitution, or that the relationship was built on material gain and not on noble mentoring and love of virtue. Homosexual relations. These were quite common, especially among men, and were not as stigmatized as in later Christian-influenced European cultures or in some modern societies. Symposia, male banquets, were often attended by young men, and homosexual relations were part of their social life, often seen as an expression of deep friendship, an intellectual union, or even a way of strengthening the warrior spirit, as in Thebes, where there was a famous sacred band of 300 warriors, consisting of 150 pairs of lovers who were thought to fight with greater courage in defense of each other, since they had nothing to be ashamed of in front of their lovers. In some ways, the ancient Greeks were much more open about this than we are, and this would be surprising and unfamiliar to us, since our culture often associates sexuality exclusively with reproduction or marriage. Sexual relations and marriage. Marriage, as mentioned, was primarily for procreation and the creation of legitimate heirs, as well as for the management of the home and property. Sexual relations within marriage were important, but for the satisfaction of sexual needs, a man could turn to hetaira, educated prostitutes who were often free women or former slaves, or slaves without social censure. This meant that men had much greater freedom in sexual relations outside marriage, while women were required to be strictly faithful and chaste, and any deviation from this rule was severely punished, including divorce and public disgrace. Such a double-standard attitude towards sexuality would be shocking and unfair from our point of view, deeply contradicting the ideas of gender equality. Public gatherings and banquets, symposia, were exclusively male events. Female citizens were strictly prohibited from entering them. At symposia, men drank wine, often heavily diluted to allow for longer conversations and not get drunk too quickly, allowing for philosophical discussions. Had philosophical discussions, read poetry, sang, listened to music, and could communicate with hetairai. These gatherings were a place where one could relax, behave freely, sometimes even frankly, without the presence of wives and daughters. For us, accustomed to mixed companies and more formal social interactions, such an atmosphere would be very specific, and its exclusively male character an indicator of a deep division of the sexes and spheres of life. Freedom of expression, jokes on the edge of decency, active debates were the norm at these gatherings. So, our detailed tour of ancient Greece has come to an end, and as you may have noticed, it was a world quite unlike our own. Ancient Greece, for all its undeniable achievements in philosophy, art, architecture, literature, theatre, and the development of democratic ideas, was a world that challenged our most fundamental notions of humanity, justice, morality, and normality, forcing us to reconsider how different cultures can be from one era to another, and how much our notions of what is acceptable and what is not have changed. This realization underscores how relative our notion of normal is, and how important it is to understand the context of any civilization.